Welcome back to Kingdom Tales. I'm Father Lee, and together we're reading The Tales of the Resistance by David and Karen Maines. Do you remember the cry of the Rangers? As they check on the safety of the whole of Great Park, they cry out to one another. They call out from one ranger tower to the next, all around Great Park. And what do they say? How goes the world? The question that they ask over and over and over again of each other is, how goes the world? How are things going in the world? And what do they call back? The world goes not well. It's true. The world goes not well. We can see that when we look around us in our world as well. We're surrounded by scary images and scary stories, by sickness and by hurt and by angry people. The world goes not well. But the story of the kingdom doesn't end with the world goes not well. Because the people of the kingdom, the people who belong to the king, like you and me, they know the truth that the king says about the world, that the kingdom comes. How goes the world? The world goes not well, but the kingdom comes. The kingdom comes. Today's story is called The Enchanter's Revenge. The fiery rage of the enchanter flamed. Revenge for the orphan exodus fell wrathfully on the city taxi company. And after burners and breakers had conducted a brutal demolition raid on the terminal, the evil eye of the enchanter hunted for one more victim. The warning bell in the underground garage was still clamoring. Barely moments had passed since the merciless attack had come and gone. Cabbies and mechanics stumbled to their feet, shaken by the brutal hostilities of the cudgels and the burning pokers of the raiding secret police. Torn from the wall, the map of Enchanted City burned on the floor. The control panel had been ruthlessly smashed, as well as the glassed-in operations office. Fires blazed in overturned buckets of greasy rags and licked their hungry tongues toward nearby oil and grease slicks. Hero climbed through a ragged hole in the overhead door, which now hung askew, and entered the garage. He had gone to the garbage dump to see if there was any sight of a returning king. Acrid smoke from the oil fires choked him. And with one quick look, he surveyed the devastation. The enchanter had had his revenge. Paint had been dashed against the fleet of taxis, windshields had been smashed, doors and fenders bludgeoned, half-opened hoods showed wires and cords ripped from the bellies of engines. He motioned to several cabbies, and together they struggled to slide the huge gaping door from its rollers so fresh air could blow into the smoky underground. The siren of the warning bell wailed uselessly. Hero looked at the dismembered control panel. No more rescue operations would be dispatched here. The resistance had been effectively disabled. But now, to the fires, to the wounded. A moment of panic. Amanda, where was that girl? And then out of the corner of his eye, he saw her tearing bandages, wiping away soot and blood from the head of a cabbie, her own face darkened by smoke and streaked with tears. "This ain't the worst of it," shouted Mac, the mechanic, hurrying past with buckets of sawdust to smother the flames of oil fires. She tossed him a shovel, took big operator, roughed him up bad, dragged him out of here. We're nothing we could do to stop him. Hero groaned as he spaded sawdust and sand. Big Operator was the brains of the resistance. He had masterminded hundreds of daring rescues, and in such clever ways that until recently, all strategy had struck at the strength of the Enchanter without incurring his wrath. But there was no time for worry. They had all that they could do to salvage something from the wreck of the city taxi company. The days that followed were wearying, worrisome. All hands worked on the dismembered fleet of taxis. Mechanics attempted to reconstruct engines. The worst fire damage was repaired. Everyone learned to live with the lingering, bitter smell of smoke. Charred cars and equipment, as well as the smashed control panel, were junked. Wounds and bruises began to heal, but no cabbies dared take the few remaining taxis out into the streets. The evil of enchantment hung heavy on their heads. No one would venture to guess whether or when the enchanter would strike again. Besides, their hearts were heavy. Defeat hung in the bitter air. There was no room for jaunty resistance. No word had come of Big Operator. And what was the resistance without Big Operator? The taxi vanguard was his strategy. The central dispatcher system, the safe houses scattered across the city for orphans and refugee outcasts. The storage cell power sources, the methods of sighting, all those were his idea. With the map destroyed, it became even more important for Hero to keep an accurate chronicle of sightings so that none of this time would be lost to memory. After working exhausting hours each night with the cleanup crews, he spent weary days writing down details, remembering himself or interviewing those who remembered the hows, whens, and wherefores of sightings of the king. He worked at the desk behind the glass panels of Big Operator's office. Naysaying choked his spirit. The resistance was shattered. There had been no sightings of the king since the orphan exodus. No one could break the enchanter's spell. And if the king returned, what could anyone do even then? Sitting at Big Operator's desk, he kept thinking of all the chief had taught him since he returned from Great Park. With their common city background, they understood one another. The gruff older man had been like a father to Hero. The father he had never known. The patient teacher. The second night, Amanda came and sat beside him. "Can I help?" she asked. With emergency nursing behind her and dispatcher responsibilities ended, she had time on her hands. Hero sighed. The chronicle was almost current. The orphan exodus had been recorded, and he had only to write about these recent terrible events. "I think I can remember everything Big Operator ever said to me." He leaned back in the chair and quoted the chief. "This is an occupied city. We're in the midst of enemy territory." He was a rough man, Amanda, but everyone in the city taxi company knew he was a man of the mind as well. It was the chief who collected the fragments of song and unwritten stories from the tale keepers for the chronicle. Without them, that history would be almost forgotten. The tales of the always young king who once ruled a city with a firm but benevolent hand, the age of rebellion when the enchanter lured away the loyalty of the citizens, and how the king went into exile vowing to return when time enough had passed for all to discover the folly of their choice, and how the fire wizard placed an enchantment over the city and ruled the subjects with the power of fire. Hero paused, remembering. My own mother must have been a tale keeper, keeping alive the old true tales. I remember her words on her dying bed. There is a king, a real king. Amanda felt tired and saddened. When would they ever be able to go back to the old ways of field and forest? "You love him, don't you?" she said, smiling gently. "Yes," said Hero. "He's a gruff old gizzard, but he's a genius, too. He'd been experimenting with daylight, "Whole city's supposed to run on it," he'd say. Solar panels, storage cells, sun batteries. He was getting us ready to live in the restoration, to live at day and sleep at night, to harness the sun to do the work that slave labor does now. Amanda quoted Big Operator, "Work in harmony with the world, not in disharmony with it." She punched the air with her fist. This was a favorite city taxi company saying. They almost heard his rough voice again. The two smiled sadly at each other. With that, Hero leaned his elbows forward on the desk and hid his face in his hands. His voice was tight with grief. "He's dead, Amanda. I know it in my heart. I can only hope he died quickly." The two were silent. Amanda didn't protest, didn't work to evoke false hope. She had already seen this terrible truth deep in her own heart. After a while, she spoke. "Did anyone tell you what Big Operator's last words were when he was taken captive? You'll need it for the Chronicle." Hero shook his bowed head, and she continued. "He'd been badly beaten. 3 or 4 breakers attacked him. Destruction was dismantling his life work. But as they were dragging him away, he struggled to his feet and called out for all of us to hear above the din. 'The restoration is near!' They knocked him senseless, as he must have known they would, but Hero, I keep hearing his cry over and over and over. 'The restoration is near!'" Hero tilted up his head, still braced in the cup of his hands, and looked at Amanda. She always had perfect aim. That and her gift of seeing had made her the quickest dispatcher in the resistance. The girl leaned over and compassionately touched his face. Did she realize she had covered his scar with her hand? He didn't think she'd even noticed. She certainly had comforted the scar in his heart. All that day, with sidelong glances, Hero watched Amanda. She was not the same as she had been. Hero missed her old impudence, the riotous imagination, the daring do that went to combat with any opponent, no matter how huge. When she laughed, most infrequently now, he was flooded with memories of sunlight and a burning circle of flames. He missed his old playfriend. He reminded himself that though she had never gone through the branding, she had been badly burned once. Evil fire of any kind always wounds the one it touches. Now she was an alien in an enemy camp, a princess in disguise, and he suspected, though she never spoke of it or complained of her assignment in this dreadful place, that she longed each moment for the beauty and sanctuary of Great Park. And yet, in some ways, she was the same. She was still spirited. It was a determined Amanda who had rescued the forbidden princess, who, despite the risk to herself, had undertaken the dangerous work of naming the names at the very center of the Dagoda. Sitting in that rescue taxi, flooded with relief that his friend was now safe with the king. That had been the first time he'd noticed how tall she had grown, and that her freckles were gone. She had changed. But then they had all changed. She reminded him of someone he knew well and couldn't place. He watched during those days of recovery as she read portions of the Chronicle to those who were still mending from injuries, as she cheerfully carried iron pots of hot broth at mealtimes, as she tenderly calmed anxiety among the rough drivers who chafed at the waiting and the disablement. Now and then she told funny little stories, and his heart gladdened at her laughter. She was still spirited, but in a subdued sort of way, and every once in a while she flared. Her eyes flashed. She became indignant. She reminded him of embers that fly when cooling coals are stirred. She was like Mercy. Amanda reminded him of Mercy. Despite himself, as he carefully finished the chronicle, helped to reorganize the taxi crew, waited impatiently for a word about Big Operator or a sighting of the king, Hero realized that he cared deeply for his one-time play friend. He knew that she could never care for him in the same way. She was of the fields. He could still see it in her eyes, the meadows, the bird song, the dappled light. He was of these city streets, dark and devastating. He knew its ways, was at home in its dead ends and confusion. Amanda felt ill at ease here, and always would. Furthermore, Amanda was a princess of the royal line. He had seen her at becoming, when she became real, a dazzling, beautiful child. Her taxi company overalls were only a disguise. It was he who was the former orphan, a street waif, a refugee who barely escaped the Enchanter's designs, upon whom the merciful people of Great Park had taken pity. And though these days he rarely thought about the scar, he knew his face was so disfigured, no young woman would ever want him. Besides, this was an inopportune place for love, this dangerous time, this evil moment locked in a desperate confrontation with the diabolical. So, Hero was silent and waited for his disturbing feelings to pass. Then, one lonely outpost sentry returned, banging on the bent, broken metal of the overhead door that had been patched. A mechanic cranked it open and closed again. A report of a sighting. Street people talked of a group who had come from the place where trees grew, through the old gates across the garbage dump. And the next night, the king himself returned to the dispirited city taxi company. It was he who brought the word which they had all been dreading. Big Operator was dead. They mourned at what they had all feared. Each reached a hand to the next. They put arms around each other, seeking comfort. The jaunty resistance was no more. And the king walked among them, as grieved as they. Big Operator and he had loved each other, and he whispered to each, "The restoration is at hand." Despite their tears, all remembered that these words had been Big Operator's last. "Don't be discouraged," he said. "The time of resistance is almost past." He gathered his faithful subjects into the great cavern of the underground terminal. Those rangers who had bravely infiltrated Enchanted City, the mechanics and drivers and duty persons of the taxi resistance. "Soon," the king said, "the enchantment over the city will be lifted. But you must be brave. You must not lose heart. The spell of the evil fire wizard can only be broken by the act of a willing victim." His words were terrible to them, though they didn't understand what he meant. Each looked into his or her own heart to examine the degree of willingness, and they were afraid. And then the king held out one hand to Amanda, and the other to Hero, and to all those who had learned the music of Great Park. A meager band of rangers wearing taxi company overalls formed a sentry circle, and there the king began the great celebration. Cabbies took overturned oil drums and beat out the rhythm that they heard, and the sound echoed in the hollow of the terminal. Others clapped time with their hands, a soft beat filled with mourning. There was no splendor of a vaulted forest above, no gifted entertainment, no lavish banquet spread before them. There was no leaping grandeur of the circle of sacred flames. The rhythm was somber, slow-moving, and sad, but it was the great celebration just the same. And those from Great Park who knew and remembered the ancient steps joined hands and made entrance in their hearts and became real. And as they passed each other, turning in the well-known patterns, music rose in their souls and peace came to their minds, even while the intense darkness outside gathered for a final onslaught. It was then that Amanda looked into Hero's eyes, and saw with her deep sight what he couldn't or wouldn't speak. She saw that he loved her. For love is a gift that surprises even in the despairing moments of danger or death, and by this we know that it mirrors a greater love, one which is never ending.